Oh, God. Thank you, Veronica. Welcome, everybody, to our Halloween special at home. I was just running through the list of our amazing international audience. We have folks from the Czech Republic and London and all over the US and Canada. And I am very happily coming to you from Italy. And I want to do an extra thanks to everybody for allowing me to adjust the time, have it a little bit later so I could go traipsing about Rome before I go home. That was very nice of you. Thank you. I was here for a conference, but I made the most of it. I'm really excited though about this event. When we did when we had our call for papers, and you always try to put things together in a really interesting way, and we had people who were working on mourning dress and burial clothes, and we thought, well, that sounds like an October event, and so that's what we're doing today. In terms of any housekeeping, you guys are already in your houses, so you know where your own fire exits and toilets are. So hopefully. But what we're going to do is we'll have each of our speakers speak and give their presentations or short talks today, sharing their research joy as we always do. And then we will have a short little period for questions. And Lynn is very kindly our question master today. So Lynn will step in and manage the questions. Please do put your questions in the chat as they come up into your head. You don't have to wait for the end. We'll keep an eye on them. Sometimes the chat discussion also gets really interesting as we go along as well. And then we'll probably have a little bit of time at the very end too, if there's any further questions to chat. So I think I've said all the things I need to say in terms of how it runs. So why don't we go ahead and get going? And I should have said that we are the 19th Century Dress and Textiles Reframed Network, but I'm assuming you know that because you're here. But our first speaker is one of our own committee members. So we're delighted to have Hilary Davidson here with us today from New York. It's no longer the middle of the night for Hilary when she comes to our events. And we should still be mindful of our Australian friends, but I'm sorry, there's an Italian dog barking now in the background. I hope it's not too loud. I will be muting very shortly, but Hilary is now, many congratulations, because she's now in New York because she is the chair of the MA Fashion and Textile Studies program at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City in lovely middle of Manhattan. And she is still an honorary associate at the University of Sydney. She was the curator of fashion and decorative arts at the Museum of London and has lectured, broadcast, and taught across a wide range of dress and textile history. She is a consultant in archaeological textiles and also for the Oxford English Dictionary, and is on the editorial board of Fashion Studies. Her extensive study of Regency dress was published as Dress in the Age of Jane Austen, and from Yale in 2019. And her next book, which she is diligently hammering away on, and I feel her pain because we're in about the same place in our books, and it's horrible right now, but she is doing an amazing, wonderful second book for Yale called Jane Austen's Wardrobe, forthcoming in 2023. So Hilary, without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you everybody else for attending. So what I want to talk about today is what the dead wear. And this is based on about a research that I've been doing since 2010 when I was at the Museum of London. And I was first asked to have a look at textiles that have been excavated from a 19th century burial site, and because there was no specialists in the archaeological arm at that time. And so that sort of began my journey into dressing the dead. And this was quite interesting for me as a dress historian, because the narratives of mourning and the 19th century are one of the sort of the great dominants of dress history. We know a lot about sort of the black and the conventions, but I had never once thought about what the dead themselves wear. What's the last thing that you ever wear? And also, who decides? So there was this fascinating contrast for me between clothing that was above ground. So this is Admiral Lord Nelson's flannel shirt, and this is the flannel shirt in which Henry Wardell was buried in 1836. And it's this incredible contrast between sort of above ground and underground clothing. And it also, it got me thinking a lot about a lot of the narratives of fashion and superficiality and passing of time, because it's not often that actually you get to see clothing still attached to their original wearers. So I'm just going to give you a quick warning before the next slide. I'm going to show a bonnet with some hair underneath it of an actual excavation. So I'm just going to have it up for a couple of seconds. If you want to look away, now's your moment. But yeah, not very elegant, but really interesting. So in Britain, archaeologists are allowed to excavate up to 150 years before the present day. And this has resulted in combination with the requirements for new buildings to have excavation work done underneath them, with an incredible amount of pieces coming up from fairly recent history. And while in dress history, we are kind of used to looking at archaeological studies for periods further in the past, this is a chance to kind of compare what's going on above and below ground in the sort of late 18th up to sort of early to mid 19th century. And you can see some of the crowding here of graves as the public cemeteries really kicked off in the 1820s to 40s. So I've looked at a lot of sites at this time, and everything that I've looked at has been cemetery textiles. And this has a different survival bias from crypt textiles. You can see here some of the beautiful crypt textiles that came out in the Spitalfields Christchurch excavation in 1993, which is kind of a landmark for burial textiles. But also here, the nightshirt of 18-year-old George Davis, the son of the tutor of Queen Victoria, who died age 18 of a cricket accident, which confirms all of my biases about cricket. But what happens in the ground is a completely different set of survivals. So you also get a different set of socioeconomic groups. And crypt burials tend to, by their very nature, be middle class or above. And so they have a higher survival of especially vegetable textiles like cotton and linen, which very, very rarely survive interment in the ground. So what you get mostly in cemetery burials is a lot of wool, mostly wool, and then silk as well, because of the proteinaceous nature of the fibers. They last a lot longer in various burial conditions. And in crypt burials, you also get more airtight or anaerobic conditions, which contribute to preservation. But in cemeteries, you have quite a range of conditions for the textiles to be in. Often it's very damp from the body, but also from the level at which it's buried. There can be patches of anaerobic preservation, but it has its own kind of survival bias built in. And for those of you who may be wondering where these pieces come from, I am working this is kind of taken from all the sites I've worked on over the last 12 years, but I'm working on a major site at the moment that if I show you the pictures from it, I can't tell you what it is because they're not published yet. So you're getting a sneak peek, but it will all come out in time. So enjoy the details while we have them. And we get kind of a range of items in burials that come out to different degrees of preservation. And you'll see that kind of brown and tattered is very much the dominant look. So we get a lot of the textiles that are used in the coffins and as to line the coffins, to decorate. So a lot of wool and worsted frills, coffin covers. Often the coffins were covered in baize, and you get survivals underneath coffin plates where the metal has ensured the survival of what's underneath. You also get a lot of union cloths that have been woven with wool one way, or wool or worsted one way, and then a vegetable fiber the other. So the cross fibers have all disappeared and you just get these crinkly noodles left. And so there's lots of kind of brown textiles that are just used to adorn coffins. Then we also get what people are actually wearing themselves, grave clothing that is real clothing. And so some of the time the people have been interred wearing actual clothing they would have worn in life. So this, for example, is a beautiful fine lamb's wool glove. This is you can just about see the very end of a sewn black cravat. And this is a trouser fly with the flap over the top and then the buttons coming up underneath. So you do get a kind of a range of items there. And one of the joys of looking at burial textiles is it shows you things that is very hard to find in the textual or the documentary record, as I'm sure Chris can attest, that the specifics of what you use to bury people, there's kind of the narratives of shrouds, but the range of things is just not very well documented. So we also have types of clothing that is made for burial. So lots of these kind of caps, sort of shroud, nightgown sort of things. People often buried in stockings. But we also, there's a type of garment that, it is thanks to Chris, I can call sham garments, which I kind of love. They're not there very often, but they're things like a fake waistcoat and a fake coat that are sewn with much bigger stitches and made to imitate real clothing, but and look like it in the coffin, but they're not actually real clothing, and they open at the back. So it's a fascinating category of garment. And a lot of the inference of what grave clothes are like can be built from tiny things like the stitch holes, the folding, and sort of see where it might have gone. So another great thing about burial textiles is that they are a source for everyday clothing. We all know that the things that survive in museums and collections are overwhelmingly middle and upper classes, and they tend to be the nice things because the ordinary things get worn out. And so what does survive in bits and pieces in graves gives us a whole alternative set of material objects with which to understand everyday clothing. So that flannel waistcoat that I showed you at the beginning, it's clearly been worn in life, and it's been patched and darned and worn. And Henry Wardle was quite old when he was buried, so it's got this lovely sense of kind of being his old shirt that he's just worn and made last, in a way that contrasts with the kind of the pristineness of Nelson's shirt. And all of these details, like the stockings and this fabulous pair of trousers that I am itching to write up, which is probably the best preserved piece of clothing that I've found, they're insights into qualities of textiles and weave that don't necessarily survive to us in other ways. So I think the richness of their possibility of sources is still being explored. And just to finish up, they're not very lovely items. They've been in the ground for a long, long time, but they are incredibly interesting. So little things that I found, like these scraps, which there's a surprising amount of in coffins, and they're the cabbage or the leftovers from cutting out nice frills that clearly the undertaker's just kind of shoved underneath the body or used as stuffing in the cushion. This bonnet, which I've reconstructed with pins, and actually we do get sometimes some very nice silk ribbons, but even there you can see a difference in quality of silk between kind of cheap undertaker quality and what I think of as fashion quality, something that you could easily use on a real bonnet or not. So even within the graves, there are hierarchies of fashion, of quality, and sort of ranges of practices about dress and textiles that it is not possible to access any other way. So I've written archaeological reports on these. I'll just pop up the reading list briefly, which I can share if people want it. This is an overall article I published on clothing and textiles from cemeteries. These are a couple of archaeological reports. The Janaway article is on this massive Spitalfields project. And then the work of Penelope Walton Rogers, who I'm sure will be familiar to many here, looking at the excavations of a similar period that she's studied as well. So I will stop there and open the floor for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Hilary. That is absolutely fascinating. I know there's a couple questions and Lynn's going to take over. And while people are typing their questions in the chat, I thought I might be cheeky because I was about to type one out and I didn't get to. So I'll just maybe kick it off and ask you, is there anything that you've seen that like you've never seen anywhere else, like lots of things like that?
Yeah, many things. The sham clothing I've never seen anywhere else. I've pulled out a couple of silk bandanas that I've never seen of that quality. There is a star find in the site that I'm working on that I'm going to do that terrible thing and go, I'm not going to talk about it here, but it's in my next book, which has been like, that's just been a research breakthrough for me, a type of object that I have never seen, and to the best of my knowledge, because I've asked, actually doesn't survive in any museum collections. So yeah, there is new things in there. I've found a couple of wig bases, which are quite rare because wigs don't tend to survive. So that's going to fit really well into other discussion of wigs and wig making. Yeah, there's interesting things that are rare of their type.
That's fantastic and so exciting for you. No, definitely don't share all the bits.
Sorry. No, it'll be great when I do.
Don't apologize. That's perfectly respectable and appropriate thing to do, but you've shared a lot with us to know that this is a really, really rich area. Lynn, do you want to take over?
Yeah, thanks very much, Robin. Yeah, I'm just sort of buzzing with questions here and I don't want to hog the chat, but a couple of things came to mind, Hilary. First of all, are there shops or at this time that are supplying grave clothing so that you don't, you can go along and you can choose what object you'd like to be buried in? Because we sort of think today, if someone dies in the family, it's always, what would you like to have them buried in? Well, it's usually the best suit or something that was their favorite article. But what happened in this period in the 19th century?
Well, this is really, because this is the early 19th century, the late 18th and early 19th century, people like Jay's Warehouse, that doesn't open until the 1840s. So I've never quite had time to really delve into what is available as mourning, or because the mourning and then grave clothes tend to go hand in hand, but there's quite scant documentary evidence. Once you get into the later 19th century, then there's more, but there's not a lot. I'm going to have to go digging quite far to find more. Okay. And it does range of practices of some people it is in their best suit, some people it's in whatever the undertaker cobbles together.
Right. And just from a sort of purely technical point of view, from a sort of archaeological point of view, what is the policy about sort of separating these articles so that they go into a museum store or museum context from the bodies? Because presumably these sites are being dug up because it's Crossrail or whatever it happens to be, or high-speed link, so obviously the graves have got to be moved. But what are the ethics around removing the grave goods, in effect, especially something as intimate as one's clothing from a skeleton or whatever is left?
I'm not so involved in that part of it, for which thank goodness. But I think it's got completely different. All of the ethical concerns are really about the bodies, obviously.
Yeah.
And the grave goods and things like the coffin plates, the remains of coffin, the coffin furnishings, any of the kind of the metallic objects, because there's a whole lot of sort of buttons and pins and things that go in there as well. They tend to stay as collections with just very, very detailed site and context numbers.
Okay, well, needless to say, we've got lots of questions coming in. And first question here from Z, who first of all says she would love to have your reading list, if that's possible. But also, as an archaeology student, she's curious about the picture of the bonnet. Was it just the hair that was preserved, or was there any?
No, that was on a skull. The bonnet was on, the hair was on the skull.
Right.
Yeah, which I have to say, I'm quite squeamish, and I like it when I don't get to see any of the body parts, and every now and then there is an unexpected thing like a toe bone in a sock, and I have to stop and take a break and go away for a bit and then come back to it, because yes, I'm very much about the clothing, not the body.
Yeah, exactly. Lisa asks, do many buttons and buckles survive? I suppose it really depends what material is that they're made from.
They do, absolutely. And this is one of the slightly awkward things about the way archaeological analysis is divided up, is that usually a small finds specialist works on those. And I will often have conversations with them, and because I'm familiar with the buttons, especially, I've been able to identify, oh, look, this is a braces button, this is a washing button, this is a shirt button. But we do get buckles, pins, buttons, lots of pins holding things in place as well. And often the metallic objects can be really helpful for giving the small vestiges of cellulose fibers, so cotton or linen, because they tarnish into the metal, and you can then sort of see where they connect. So they're quite a good preservation method as well, but they tend to get catalogued separately,
Right.
unless I find them stuck to something.
Yeah. Anna asks, is there anything on objects or clothing that you've come across that suggests the deceased had a political identity that they took to the grave?
Not so much a political, but a religious identity. So the first, so both of the Southwark excavations here, the New Bunhill Fields and the Tower Hamlets, at least the first one, it was what's the word? Non-conformist cemetery. So you had a lot of Irish burials, and you were finding things like a Sacred Heart that was buried with them, non-Church of England or Baptist. So there are little mementos that do go in to signify belief, I suppose, more. And they are all documented in both of these. The full reports sort of talk about the context for those. And that's really interesting, because they are lower class, working class, outside of the kind of the mainstream norm of London society at the time, and definitely finding things that indicate that even in the graves.
Right. Another question here from Gail. Given that that was a Spitalfields excavation, are there many pieces of silk clothing, or at least would indicate the silk weaving and dyeing of that particular area?
Oh, that's a good point. I haven't read the Janaway article recently enough to be able to answer that accurately. I think off the top of my head, it's more in relation to sort of the merchant work of it rather than the physical work. I have found, I have looked at things that came out of a grave of what appeared to be a fabric printer, where the two printing pads that you use to put, maybe it wasn't even a fabric printer, but the pads you use to ink up the sheet were included in the grave with them. But I would recommend going back and reading the Janaway article, because I can't answer that definitely.
Okay, I'm conscious that we've got probably running out of time, so I probably should just end the Q&A there, though there are still lots of questions coming in for Hilary, so maybe there'll be an opportunity to ask those at the end, and I'll pass back to Robin to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Yes, I mean, yeah, we can't wait to read that work. That's going to be so good. It's just really groundbreaking. It's just what a unique opportunity. Okay, so our next speaker, we're delighted to have Chris Woodyard, who is an Ohio writer and historian. Chris has a degree in medieval and Renaissance studies with a minor in art history from Ohio State University. She's the author of the Victorian Book of the Dead, a book on popular and material culture of Victorian mourning and death, as well as 9 books on Ohio ghost lore, 3 volumes of Victorian and Edwardian ghost stories, and the forthcoming A is for Arsenic, a little book of Victorian death in 2023. Man, these are all really good things. Can you just stick around and tell some ghost stories after? So good. She's a member of the Costume Society of America, the Association of Dress Historians, and the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals. Her research interests center on the ephemera of dress, mourning, and material culture, burial clothing, Victorian and Edwardian ghost lore, and tokens of death. Her talk is part of a larger work in progress on the cultural history of mourning crape. So Chris is here to talk to us today about grief and grievance, mourning crape as a symbol of protest. So please, Chris, take it away. Take your time, share your screen.
Sharing
evening.
screen now, we hope.
Yeah.
And all right, good. Thank you so much. I'm just delighted to be here today and share this spooky season. This isn't particularly spooky, but it is on Mourning. So here we are. On the afternoon of June 2nd, 1854, thousands of Bostonians took to the streets. Anthony Burns, an enslaved man who'd found freedom in Boston, had been captured under the Fugitive Slave Act and was marched down to the docks to be returned to his former enslaver. As the procession passed, attorney John C. Park flung black cambric from his office windows. An abolitionist newspaper suspended American flags draped in crepe, and a full-sized coffin labeled "The Death of Liberty," so that the melancholy cortege had to pass beneath these tokens of mourning. As Boston theologian James Freeman Clarke wrote, "Now would be the time for this community to put on mourning, to wear black crepe on the arm, because honor is dead, because humanity is dead." Crepe is well known to dress historians as the fabric of sorrow. What's less well known is that crepe was also a fabric of politics and protest. It was deployed in demonstrations, in rallies, strikes, and wherever the aggrieved mourned the death of freedom. Originally, crepe was a costly crimped silk fabric used for royal and aristocratic mourning well before Queen Victoria's reign. It was criticized by medical authorities and social reformers who complained that its dyes and fixities were toxic, its color depressing, and its cost ruinous. But etiquette decreed that crepe was essential for the first or deep mourning, which might last from 6 to 12 months. Funereal imagery has long been used as a form of nonviolent protest, and to understand crepe's impact as a protest medium, we must note the strong emotions provoked by the fabric. Those wearing crepe would be instantly recognized as bereaved and entitled to sympathy and respect. Yet, in another context, crepe could evoke terror. In the 19th century, one of the first acts of a bereaved household was to hang crepe on the door. We've lost the thread of this deeply terrifying symbolic object, and we have no conception of the shock that crepe could cause. Viewers reported reactions like, "The breath seemed to leave my body," and "a sudden coldness at the heart, as if a bolt of ice had pierced it." The textile elicited such an extreme emotional reaction, it was just a small step from using crepe for grief to weaponizing it for grievance. The aggrieved public found ways early on to subvert crepe's traditional uses to express rage and dissent. There's reports of mock funeral demonstrations starting in the 18th century, as we see in many satirical prints. One of the earliest uses of protest crepe was in 1763 in Devonshire, where an apple tree was hung with crepe to protest an excise tax on cider. Crepe was a constant thread in the campaign for Irish independence. Some 80,000 people turned out in Dublin to protest English injustice as they followed empty hearses commemorating the Manchester martyrs, 3 Irish Republican Brotherhood members who were executed in 1867. An eyewitness of this protest funeral reported how the windows of the city shops were one mass of crepe and green ribbon, funeral knots, badges, scarves, hat bands. Marchers wore upon the left shoulder a green rosette, and on their left arm, a band of crepe. Now, demonstrators frequently mourn not just for a person, but for a principle. It was reported of Irish protesters at a Fenian funeral in 1869 that, quote, "the mourners took great care to show that their purpose was political," unquote, by wearing green ribbons with crepe rosettes. Early in the 20th century, temperance crusader Carrie Nation was well known for her widow's bonnet and veil, donned for her alcoholic first husband and for the many other lives lost to demon rum. There are multiple reports of saloon owners draping their premises with crepe when local temperance ordinances closed them down. But the most dramatic protest was staged in 1926 by the anti-prohibition World War Veterans Light Wine and Beer League. These happy imbibers invited a literal boatload of reporters who watched as the 3 men draped the Statue of Liberty in 60-foot long strips of crepe flung out of the windows in the statue's crown. Labor activists and strikers frequently employed mourning imagery to make their points, even putting crepe on the doors of strike breakers as a warning. After the 1914 Ludlow massacre, when striking miners and their families were gunned down in Colorado, mine owner John D. Rockefeller Jr. was blamed for the violence and was targeted by a group of protesters wearing mourning bands who marched day and night before Rockefeller's offices and home. Crape also served as a protest in the domestic sphere. We're all familiar with the pejorative, "You are dead to me." Well, a similar impulse led spurned suitors and angry parents to complain with Crape. In 1893, Charles Simon in Milwaukee strongly opposed his daughter Amanda's marriage. But after she eloped, her father ordered her from the house and hung white crepe on the door, white for someone unmarried, telling the neighbors that his daughter was dead to him. And after a quarrel with his wife, a St. Louis husband put crepe on his door and announced her death. This enraged the lady so much that she immediately eloped with someone new. It was often ambiguous as to whether someone was craping for a corpse or for a cause. This ambiguity was found in the ceremonies for Miss Emily Wilding Davidson, the suffragette, who died after throwing herself in front of King George's horse at the Epsom races in 1913. The honor guards surrounding the building where the coffin of Miss Davidson lay all wore mourning bands, and the hundreds who attended the coroner's inquest wore sleeve bands of mourning in memory of Miss Davidson. Her funeral allowed the suffragettes to highlight their cause. Now, the general consensus among etiquette experts was that the use of crepe armbands by men as mourning for servants and the military made them an unacceptable form of mourning for women. So it was a daring and subversive act for women to co-opt the man's mourning symbol, giving them masculine energy and authority. The protesters at Emily Wilding's funeral wore fashionable feminine clothes in white, trimmed with lace and embroidery. Hats and gloves were worn. The marchers might have been going to a garden fete, except for the deadly black armbands. Today, we think of public mourning as optional, but it was not always so. Just as a woman might be harshly censored for not wearing what was deemed correct mourning, so persons who refused to crepe their homes or businesses might be threatened with violence or death. Draping or wearing crepe was a public duty, a performative way of demonstrating a universal sorrow. After President McKinley was assassinated in 1901, the owner of a Brooklyn delicatessen was threatened with lynching by his neighbors when he didn't hang mourning for the dead president. Similar intimidation occurred after the 1865 death of President Lincoln, when some Southern communities were ordered to drape their houses or have them confiscated. A young woman from Louisiana confided to her diary, quote, "Men who have hated Lincoln with all their souls under terror of confiscation and imprisonment, which they understand is the alternative, tie black crepe from every knob to save their homes," unquote. Just as households hung crepe for a death, the citizens of France mourned for the invasion of their country in one of the longest running crepe protests on record. On 17 February 1871, as Prussian troops marched into Paris, the statue of Strasbourg in the Place de la Concorde was shrouded in mourning crepe, representing the loss of Alsace. And for 43 years, the statue of Strasbourg was covered in mourning wreaths and crepe until August 1914, when Alsace was finally restored to France. The wearing of mourning and black armbands for protest persisted in the 20th and 21st centuries. In 1965, 3 Iowa students were suspended when they wore black armbands decorated with peace signs to protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. They took their case to the Supreme Court and won. And funereal imagery was used on the eve of the trial for the former police officer accused of killing George Floyd. Silent mourners carried a coffin through the streets of Minneapolis. How little has changed since 1854, when Anthony Burns was marched back into bondage beneath a coffin suspended over a Boston street. We make a grave mistake when we limit Crape's meaning to the conventional uses, whether mourning the loss of a loved one or the perceived loss of freedom. Crape had a sort of inherent ability to communicate grief and grievance as a sartorial SOS. Crape used for protest expands our consciousness of clothing and textiles into a wider cultural sphere and reminds us of those words attributed to Mother Jones, the American labor organizer: mourn the dead, but fight like hell for the living. Thank you.
Wow, Chris, thank you so much. That was so eloquent and moving. I
Thank
love
you.
that you have, we can have Veronica can take care of the
Okay, all right.
chair. Don't worry about it.
Trying.
No, I know. That was just so beautiful. And I just love that you've also brought the power, the contemporary relevance and power of it into your talk. I also have to say, your video was glitching in a really fun way that was kind of spooky. No, it was like a haunted, like the kind of thing you see in like a horror thing. So
Yeah.
it was really, it just added this extra intensity.
Oh dear.
No,
Poltergeist.
like it was good. I know, a little bit. Lynn, do we have some questions coming in, or do you?
We haven't got any questions coming in yet, just lots of comments saying how fascinating it all was. I wanted to ask you, Chris, why was, I don't know whether you may have said this and I might just have missed it, why was crepe particularly chosen as the fabric, or is it just that that's the name for a black fabric rather than a specific weave or textile for the cloth?
Good question, because there is kind of a divergence there. Actual crepe, as made by, say, Kontou, and was this crimped silk fabric. It was very, very expensive. They had a virtual monopoly on it. But when you see things about, we draped crepe for Abraham Lincoln, it's never quite clear whether it is actual silk fabric or it's a lot of other, perhaps calico or muslin. We know that the White House was draped in muslin inside. Crepe was so very expensive that it would be unlikely that it would be put out in the rain. And yet we know that in some cases it actually was. And it was almost like putting expensive goods in the grave. It's a sort of a sacrifice. Although there are also stories about after mourning, for example, President Garfield was over, the crepe was all gathered up and it was given to veterans' families, who, like widows and orphans, to make clothing out of. So it was actually recycled. So again, we have a problem with, is it real crepe or is it just a black fabric? But the genuine crepe is that crinkly, textured silk fabric. Why it was chosen for mourning, possibly because it's dark and it's dull. It has a dull finish to it. It's also a bit penitential because it's kind of, it's not very comfortable to wear.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. Thanks ever so much. Z, I think, Z, your question is very much sort of picking up there really what Chris has already said, talking about the quality of the difference and the price in it. Is there anything, Z, that you would like to add to your question at this stage?
Well, so that makes me wonder whether crepe was something that, say, a working class family could afford. And even in the case of like these labor protests, whether it would be possible to deck out an entire group of protesters in silk crepe. And I think the answer to that is no, if I'm understanding correctly.
There was a lively secondhand market in crepe. Okay. People also would dye ordinary clothing that wasn't necessarily made of crepe, but they would dye it black and use that for mourning. So even the lower classes who could not afford it tried to afford it. You'd go to the pawn shop, you'd ask your neighbors, you'd dye some garment you already had, because it was a matter of respect for the dead. You really wanted to show, and you did your best. You know, sometimes maybe you only had an armband, but if you could get the full outfit. There's also stories of people who bought black suits for their sons to wear to the funeral, and then they immediately went to the pawn shop afterwards. And you had the burial club also that would perhaps finance some of the mourning clothing. Thank you, Hilary, for the Norwich crepe.
Yeah,
the
that's
imitation. Yes,
thank you.
should have mentioned that.
Yeah, Emily asks, are there any other colors other than white and black that are used? You know, just because you're thinking about mourning clothing going through from black to gray and lilac.
Right. Yeah. In half mourning, you had gray and mauve and purple and violet. Sometimes you see purple hangings for mourning in public, but not very often. It's actually more of a royal, but sometimes you do see it.
Caroline, picking up again on this, the terminology here. When was crepe paper introduced in relation to fabric crepe? Any idea if it was intended as an inexpensive alternative?
Probably not to be used as mourning anything. It was, I believe, and please don't quote me because I'm not a paper historian, but I believe it was introduced in the 19-teens, and just as a craft.
Okay.
To be used in crafts.
Anna asks us a question specifically coming back to the abolitionist use of crepe at the beginning of your talk. Did it really shock? Did it draw the same sort of criticism that our Just Stop Oil protesters do? She's just sort of trying to gauge what the public reaction would have been at the time. So
there was a good deal of animosity in the South when they were told, they were ordered to mourn for President Lincoln. And it was said that the more crepe you saw in a house, the more the people there hated Lincoln. They overdid it because they didn't want their houses to be taken away.
Wow. Okay. There are lots more comments coming in, but I think, again, given how the time is progressing, I'm going to hand back to Robin and we can pick up on any extra questions at the end if there are a few minutes.
Thanks, Lynn. You're very good at that timing thing. Appreciate that. Okay, so our next speaker is Tatiana. I should have asked you is it Kontou? Is that right? Pronunciation?
That's right.
Good.
Yeah.
I should have asked that before we started. I'm sorry. Tatiana is a senior lecturer in 19th century literature at Oxford Brookes University in the UK. She's author of Spiritualism and Women's Writing from Palgrave in 2009 and editor of Women and the Victorian Occult, Routledge 2010. She's co-edited with Sarah Wilburn, the Ashgate Research Companion to 19th Century Spiritualism and the Occult. These are all books I really need to get on my shelf, by the way. Very exciting. And edited a volume of primary sources on anti-spiritualism, 1840 to 1930. Tatiana has also contributed essays and journal articles on Wilkie Collins, Florence Marriott, sensation fiction, psychical research, and detective stories. Her most recent project is a 6-volume collection of primary sources on Victorian material culture, coming from Routledge 2022, which she co-edited with Victoria Mills. For this collection, Cara Tennant and Tatiana edited a volume on fashionable things, focused on the middle-class Victorian woman, and her things ranging from the beautiful to the bizarre. So, gosh, that's a lot of stuff for my reading list. But if you want to go ahead, Tatiana, she's talking to us today about how to mourn and avoid melancholia through Victorian fashion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this introduction. I realized I had moved from the spirit to the material in this. I think I'm sharing my screen now. Am I? Oops. Okay, give me a minute. Great. Okay.
There you go.
Great. Okay. So as Robin said, I recently co-edited this collection on Victorian material culture with Vicky Mills, and I co-edited this volume on fashionable things, and because of this project, I developed an interest in Victorian mourning wear. And I'm very kind of new to Victorian mourning wear, having always worked with the spiritualism and sciences. So I would like to pursue this interest further, and I'll be very, very grateful to your comments and suggestions and thoughts later. So what I would like to think about is how material things, and particularly mourning wear and adornments, facilitated different kinds of psychic and cultural work. When sifting through Victorian periodicals, I was particularly surprised to find that engravings of fashionable mourning and half-mourning dress frequently appeared in women's magazines and presented figures with readers with figures of the recently bereaved in the latest Parisian and London fashions. Advertisements also of the recent mourning warehouses and emporia were often placed very close to advertisements for wedding and baby trousseaux and pianofortes and whatnot. And I was intrigued by the contemporary reader who would have pored over these images and their descriptions to fashion herself according to the latest modes, but also to consider the display of her own emotions at times of loss, calibrated according to the most recent etiquette and dress patterns. So in this way, I guess women were obliged to consider the loss of loved ones through the lens of the practicalities of how to dress and what was considered acceptable in mourning wear. So after reading in a footnote to Freud's seminal essay, Mourning and Melancholia, that the German term, I apologize because I don't speak German, Trauer, like an English mourning, can mean both the affect of grief and its outward manifestation, I began thinking about the possible connections between Victorian mourning wear and etiquette and how those sartorial conventions might be facilitated to an extent. Might be facilitating the very painful and prolonged work of mourning that Freud is talking about. And I hope this kind of explains and partly excuses the very clunky title of my paper this evening. So Mourning and Melancholia was published in 1917 and engaged with the questions of loss and how one reacts to the loss of a person through death. Freud distinguished between mourning and melancholia and identified their similarities. And he also found one crucial difference. So he talked about how mourning is regularly the reaction to the loss of a loved person or to the loss of some abstraction which has taken place of one, such as one's country, liberty, an ideal, and so on. And I think it kind of is in harmony with what Chris was talking about of using Crape for political causes. So we rely on its being overcome after a certain lapse of time, and we look upon any interference with it as useless and even harmful. So he sees mourning as a very kind of natural process that should be let to run its course. So the distinguishing mental features of melancholia, he says, are a profoundly painful dejection, cessation of interest in the outside world, loss of capacity to love, inhibition to all activity, and a lowering of the self-regarding feelings to a degree that finds utterance in self-reproaches and self-revilings. This picture becomes a little more intelligible when we consider that, with one exception, the same traits are met with in mourning. The disturbance of self-regard is absent in mourning, but otherwise the features are the same. So you can't really kind of distinguish between a mourner and a melancholic up to the point of self-hatred. And as Freud points out, the melancholic resembles the mourning in every way but that. The work of mourning is painful and lengthy and might include fantasies and dreams where the object, he says, is considered to be still alive, but and I quote from Freud, normally respect for reality gains the day. And in what is carried out bit by bit at great expense of time and energy, the lost object is allowed to be experienced as gone, And again, to quote from him, when the work of mourning is completed, the ego becomes free and uninhibited again. In the melancholic, though, ambivalent feelings towards the loss of an object, the death of a simultaneously loved and hated person, for example, urge the melancholic to identify with the lost person and might even begin to adopt the deceased's mannerisms. So in Mourning, Freud tells us it is the world which has become poor and empty. In Melancholia, it is the ego itself. And kind of the mourner is more of an elegiac figure, lamenting the loss of the beloved in the world. So now I will turn my attention to Victorian fashion and parse out some of the ways in which fashionable mourning wear might complement and facilitate the work of mourning to take place, and perhaps even assist it in the mourner in veering away from melancholia. So the criticisms and debates surrounding the strict sartorial and social rules for mourners, and particularly women, were ample and well rehearsed. One example from Elizabeth Gaskell's 1848 novel, Mary Barton, is a scene where Mary is discussing the financial burden placed on families when she is called upon to make mourning wear for Mrs. Ogden and her children on account of Mrs. Ogden's husband's death, and we're told that he drank himself to death. Mary's interlocutor, Margaret, sees mourning as giving people, and I quote, something to do, besides, it says, crying out. So indeed, Mary Barton, although critical of the financial strain mourning wear places on families, mentions how the Ogdens, and I quote, cheered up wonderful while she was there, and she asked them far more directions than usual, that they might have something to talk over. Mary leaves a fashion book with she notes is already 2 months old. So as this example from an 1850 issue of the Ladies' newspaper makes clear, mourning was following current fashionable trends and the conventions of elegance set by Paris and London. We see that the cloak is one of the one of the novelties of the present season, and although kind of loss was permanent, fashions representing it were very ephemeral. So, however, I think that the temporality of fashion that Mary is mentioning, the fashion book she leaves, is already 2 months old. And we see in this issue from the 1850s Ladies' newspaper that this is the present season's trends that are adapted for mourning wear. Is important here if we consider Freud's concept of the melancholic who is filled up and taken over by the past. The mourners in Gaskell's narrative, similarly to the interested readers of fashion magazines, are kept to an extent from dwelling too much in the past as they follow the fast pace of fashion. Passion for fashion, I guess a Freudian slip there. Sorry, I suck at bad puns tonight. So Caroline Stephen, however, disagrees with more modest mourning wear. And in her article titled Thoughtfulness in Dress, that was published in the Cornhill magazine in 1868, it's a rather lengthy quote, and being conscious of time, I won't read through it, but she finds that the conventional use of crepe and jet ornaments and black adornments are rather crude, and notes that translations of fashionable items into mourning wear is ill-timed and showing affectation. And she's extending her discussion to discuss crepe itself, which is a peculiarly bad material for the purpose, she says, from its expensiveness and its liability from every drop of rain, as Chris also mentioned in her presentation. And she further criticizes the adornments, for example, jet ornaments, which she sees as in juxtaposition with a desire to grieve. And from this late 1890s ad, Priestley's had kind of placed in Myra's journal. We see that the court-old waterproof Crape had mitigated for its destruction in rainy days. These are two examples of the kinds of ornaments in Whitby and French glass that Stephen is critical about. And she sees them as superfluous and not having a place on the body of the mourner. However, I think the popularity of hair jewelry, besides its sentimental import, assisted the work of mourning, as these adornments are a constant visual and tangible reminder of the lost beloved. And to quote from Deborah Lutz here, the hair relic makes apparent the terrible poignancy of the body becoming object to dwell in, and with the moment of loss itself. And so the wearer of such kind of ornaments was constantly reminded that the person mourned for was now dead and gone. And instead of kind of being possessed by the dead, it had an understanding that part of that body had now become, like the locks of hair had now become encased in an object that was worn next to the mourner's skin. So the mourner kind of gradually acknowledges and laments the loss of the object from the world, as distinct from the melancholic, who is almost possessing and being possessed by the dead. And fashionable mourning wear and etiquette urge the mourner to stay with the living through, again, an emphasis on time passing, on temporality and visibility. These guidelines from Myra's journal indicate the appropriate mourning wear according to the passage of time. And since they've published here the appropriate mourning wear according to the Queen's Magazine and the Ladies' Pictorial for a widow and daughter and sister, and from other fashionable magazines of the time, so that the reader would have a sense of what the appropriate times for wearing crape and veils and deep mourning were. And gradually, as the mourner comes to terms with the loss of the beloved object, and I quote from Freud, reality gains the day, she begins to dress in lighter shades of gray and lilac before gradually returning to colored clothes. And I just wanted to show you a few images here. First, excuse me. In the woman in deep mourning, that she wears a veil as well. She becomes almost this kind of cutout or shadow into the world to signify the great shock and loss experienced. And the quote next to it is from, again, Myra's journal of 1877, when it is appropriate to wear a veil and for how long. And then we kind of move on to half mourning. We see here kind of the summer dresses of half mourning. According to Pam Ferswell, the economic theory of mourning and melancholia suggests a world where people are literally filled up or taken over by the past. And as a theory, melancholia resembles a ghost story in which the ghost of the dead past invades the self. But I think this kind of fashionable mourning wear and the gradual returning to colored clothes, from the black to the gray to the lilac, and then to full kind of color clothes if one chose, prevents this kind of the past invading the self from happening, at least on a very visible and conscious level. So I want to end my I want to end my talk with this lovely engraving from the Ladies' Treasury, where we see this elegant woman in half mourning, and she's pictured in medias res putting on a glove as she prepares to go out. And the woman regards herself in the mirror, and we regard her in a way that it makes us kind of also have an affective identification with her. And I was really interested in the description of the use of the bands of silk knotted and the ends fringed, and all this kind of bordering that this particular outfit had, which is not kind of an isolated fringe or there's nothing kind of particular about this, the fringing, the bordering in this outfit, but it kind of, the image stuck with me because I came across it at the time that I was reading an essay by Elaine Freedgood on fringe and the kind of cultural and psychic work fringe does. And I think that the details and the trimmings of these mourning dresses might be interpreted as containing, as framing the mourner as someone who is kind of distinct from the one that has been lost. And she re-enters the world of the living. Her clothes signify that she's thinking about the dead, she's thinking, she's feeling for them, but she's not taken over by their ghosts. And I'd like to end here. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. I think that that was we've had actually 3 really incredibly rich papers, but who was it who pointed out in chat? Andrea, wasn't it? Yeah, we all do. I don't think we've totally forgotten that literature is such an incredible source, but like what we can get from literature and learn from texts about clothing, I think you've shown very well here. And I know there's a couple questions that have come in. I wanted to mention though, really quickly, that what this has reminded me, all these talks, but your talk especially has reminded me of, and I'll put it in the chat, that the current call for papers for the Journal of Design History is a special issue on design in the occult, if people don't know. So I will, and the CFP deadline is later this week. It's the 5th of November. I'm going to be throwing mine together when I get back. So I'll put that in the chat right now, because I think if you didn't know, and I think probably all the research here, there might be an interesting contribution. So before I forgot, I want to just say that quickly. And Lynn, if you want to take it away from me, that'd be great.
Thanks, Robin. I've got a couple of questions actually, Tatiana, that came to mind. In literature, is there any comment about people, being shamed for not observing the ritual of mourning and the various clothes, the different colours that one has to wear for particular periods of time? And also, this dress seems to be very much a code for middle and upper class. I mean, if you're a working class person, you couldn't possibly do this, I mean, you've got to get back to working and providing for your family. So what evidence is there in literature that might throw extra light on that, along, together with the clothing that we can obviously see in museum collections?
So so this is kind of a new area for me, but from what I have read so far, particularly in sensation fiction, in The Doctor's Wife and Mary Elizabeth Braddon, and short stories published in journals, there is a kind of a criticism on being too fashionable in mourning wear. So that perhaps it is better to wear simpler clothes of fabrics that are in very, very dull hues, or black, that are not crepe, that are not very expensive, that you don't need to have any adornments on you if you don't want to. And I'm thinking here of a particular story called Gloves Evidence, published in the Argosy, where the lady's maid is dressed more appropriately and more elegantly than the lady, and the lady shows her fingers that all have mourning rings, and she says to her, so you don't approve of this? And the maid servant says, well, if I must give an opinion, no, I don't think them in good taste. So there is kind of in Mary Barton as well, there is an anxiety to adhere to these conventions, but perhaps also in literature adhering too much is seen as is criticized. If someone is bedecked in jet fringe and diamonds, and that there's too much of a show. I don't know if I'm answering your question though.
Yes, no, you are. I mean, it's interesting. Andrea has just pointed out that she says she thinks she remembers from Dickens and Wilkie Collins, them noting, talking about the quality of mourning and noting that whether fabrics or clothing appeared cheap or poorly constructed. So that again sort of seems to fit in with what we've been talking
yes.
about there.
And a lot of these journals, Myra's journal, for example, was also aspirational, so it would have been read by lower middle class women who wanted to see what the upper classes were wearing and trying to kind of appropriate these fashions for their own financial means.
Right. There's a question here from Wendy. Why wasn't the strict colour coding for mourning wear imposed on men?
That's a question I've asked myself many times, and I don't have an answer for it. I know that for men, they could wear a black armband, or if they were wearing that they shouldn't wear a gold watch chain if they were in deep mourning. And there is evidence. I think I've seen an image of a Whitby jet watch chain in the V&A. But similarly, a man could marry shortly after he became widowed, and a woman could not. But I'm not really, I guess, I don't want to make a broader general comment about the double standards and different spheres, but I guess that's part of it.
Yeah. Also, I wondered, I mean, what for younger people, below the age of 21, I mean, are they wearing the same level of mourning clothing or not? Or is this something that it's, one is wearing as an adult rather than in childhood? Because I mean, there must have been lots of instances, or obviously there were lots of instances where children are losing parents or losing siblings, and are they expected to be wearing some kind of mourning dress as well?
I've seen engravings of little girls in fashionable mourning, where it's a black dress with white cuffs and collars. But for younger persons, I think I read somewhere that a daughter, but it doesn't signify her age, but she can start wearing Whitby jet immediately if she wishes to. So perhaps it was also a matter of personal tastes or financial means, the extent that the kind of the black and somber clothes would be adorned. And
right. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to pass back to Robin because I'm aware that we've still got the museum 5 minutes to do, Robin.
Yes, thanks so much, Lynn. So yeah, this is the point in our program when we have invited a museum collection, or rather a curator from a museum collection, to talk to us a little bit about what they have. And it always piques our interest. We find new places we might want to go and do some research. So tonight we've got Joe Lance with us from the Worthing Museum, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the amazing fancy dress collection that they have there. So go ahead, Joe.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen. We practiced this earlier and it worked, so come on. Here we go. Can you see that? Does that look okay? All
Perfect.
good?
That's
lovely. Thank you. I'm going to share with you today one of my favourite pieces from the wonderful collection at Worthing Museum and Art Gallery, which is a collection I know very well from my own PhD research. And it is a wonderful dress, and it's slightly creepy, which I'm hoping will be appropriate for us today, because it is a Victorian fancy dress adorned with beetle wings as part of the embroidery. And one of the things that I've always found really intriguing about this dress is that when the dress came into the collection in 1955, the original owner, maker or wearer was not identified. So we know very little about the provenance of this dress. And that is the case with a great many of the pieces in Worthing collection, particularly the ones which are homemade. We have lots of things and we don't necessarily know the backstory of them. So what follows is my attempt to place this dress into some sort of context through my own investigations. And briefly, the dress, we know that it's dated to the 1890s from the construction of the bodice, which has the really full sleeves that were very fashionable in the mid 1890s, and from the way that the bodice is boned and pointed at the front. And it has this skirt, which is made from a cream cottonette, and it's embroidered with metallic threads, threaded with iridescent green wing cases of the jewel beetle. There's a slightly closer detail there, so hopefully you can get some idea of how intricate the embroidery is. And we think it was a fancy dress. And the reasons for believing this is that the silhouette of the dress, although we know it's from the 1890s, it doesn't conform to the perfect silhouette, which would have been fashionable in that period, because the skirt is very full. It's not smooth over the hips and flowing outwards at the bottom, which would have been more likely for fashionable dress. And also because of the way it's constructed. I'm a maker myself, and I'm really interested in how dresses are put together. And this one is very crudely sewn on the inside. And it very much looks as if the skirt has been removed from an earlier piece and then tacked on to a later bodice to create a fancy dress. Which suggests that the fabric of the skirt was considered quite valuable and preserved and then reused, which is something that is really interesting. The embroidery itself is really beautiful, and the arrangements of the beetle wings, which work like sequins or spangles and really catch the light, they give the dress a very ethereal fairy tale quality, which supports the argument that it was likely to be a fancy dress. And the pieces of beetle wing have been pierced and then sewn, so they are used effectively like natural sequins. And the metallic embroidery flows around the skirt and leads your eye around. It's a really beautiful thing. And also I think the fact that the beetle wings are so fragile, which would have limited the use of the textile, adds to this sort of sense of extravagance and decadence of the piece, which is also really interesting. And we know that the use of beetle wings for embroidery has a long history. It goes back to the Indian Mughal courts of the 17th and 18th century, where they were worn as signifiers of rank. And the beetle wings cases were collected in Burma and sold through markets in Calcutta. And they were valued for their hardness, their iridescence, and the permanence of the colour, which is actually not a pigment at all. It's formed by the way that the beetle wing actually refracts the light for evolutionary reasons. And they were originally believed to ward off evil spirits. And then later the embroideries became very popular with Western women in India and Europe during the 19th century colonial period. And we know that embroideries with beetle wing decoration were initially made in India for export. The V&A has lots of export samples, for example, in their collection, which supports that. But they were so popular here in Europe that English embroiderers started importing beetle wings to imitate the embroidery domestically here as well. So you can see the spread of the idea and how popular it was. And something that struck me about the dress was how this Victorian taste for the exotic, for interesting gem-like things from around the empire, intersects with a heightened interest in natural history, which is occurring in the late Victorian period, and people like Charles Darwin and his contemporaries, their ideas about collecting and preserving the natural world and how it can be collected and conquered in a way. That's something that really interests me. And the beetle in particular captivated eminent natural historians, but also amateur collectors. They were really widely collected, and they were particularly favoured because of their profusion and diversity. There are literally millions of types of beetles out there, so it's almost like an endless collection. You can never collect them all. And we know that Darwin was an avid collector of beetles as he was a child, and that inspired his career later. So I'm really interested in that kind of Victorian enthusiasm for beetles and how they pop up periodically in popular culture, and also in the way that the animal kingdom was captured and exploited for fashionable purposes and scientific purposes, and how it's all connected. If we move forward a slide, in terms of insects and fancy dress, as is very well documented, by the 1890s, fancy dress balls and pageants were really popular in Western Europe and America, and there's some wonderful books on this. And while researching this, I looked at Arden Holt's What to Wear at Fancy Balls, which is a very popular guide to coming up with ideas for fancy dress parties. And it went through 6 editions from 1879 to 1896. And each time, each edition expands on the last, and by the latter issues, there are colour plates. And this is one of them here, and that's a hornet from 1896. And the contemporary fascination with etymology is reflected in this series. And I think it's really interesting because insects have their own life cycle, which often involves a dramatic metamorphosis, and that parallels the theme of the transformation, which is at the heart of a successful fancy dress costume. And in the 1887 edition, there are suggestions for a bee, a hornet, a dragonfly, a butterfly, and a beetle. And the description of the beetle is a dress of green tulle or green and gold tissue trimmed with iridescent beads. And I think that really encapsulates the dress at Worthing perfectly. And it suggests that you might like to wear it with a pointed velvet cap or a couple of toy beetles in your hair. And I really wish that there were hair ornaments that had survived with the dress, but alas, that is not the case. But I think it's really fun to visualize those things in place. Ooh. So to our modern eyes, the idea of wearing insect carapaces on clothing seems rather macabre. But during this period, there was a real passion for using parts of dead animals as ornaments, both in the home and on the bodily person. And the more exotic, the better. Iridescent materials such as beetle wings and the plumage of the hummingbird or the peacock were particularly prized. And whole taxidermied birds were used on hats, for example. So it's so far removed from modern sensibilities that it makes this sort of garment particularly fascinating and intriguing to us today, I think. And in my reading on the Victorian grotesque, I was looking at Sheila Wilson, and she talks about how the definition of the grotesque goes beyond the simply monstrous or perverse and involves a specific relationship between the object and the physical connection with the body. And I think that really resonates here because she observes that there's a disquieting disruption in the idea that an ornament, such as the beetle wing, which is intended to feminize the feminine and the beautiful, result in a body being covered in dead insects. So I suppose really it's the tension between the beauty and the revulsion, which is at the heart of this sort of garment, which I find most interesting. And although when they were beautifully arranged and skillfully embroidered onto the textile as though they were gems or sequins, they were abstracted from their original form, but everybody would have known what they were. In the Victorian period, insect jewellery was very popular, and other beetle wing embroidered dresses from this period survive in the museum collections. The V&A has one that they showed in 2018 as part of Fashion from Nature. And on the left here, there's an image of the costume that Ellen Terry famously wore when she was Lady Macbeth in 1888. And it's a dress that's crocheted and absolutely encrusted with thousands and thousands of beetle wings. And it has this magnificent, almost snake-like quality to it. It looks like it's entirely covered in scales, and it's very strange and it's very dark and completely appropriate for Lady Macbeth. So I suppose really, I just wanted to share with you this fabulous example and to think a little bit about what can we glean from garments when they are anonymous and we don't know very much about the reasons for their being. And I suppose really the fact that it's a composite garment, and the likelihood is that the skirt was from an earlier piece and then refashioned as fancy dress at the end of the 19th century when the vogue for costume balls was reaching its peak. I love the way how it is indicative of the sort of improvised nature of fancy dress, which is something I'm really interested in amateur sewing, and how often you use what you have, or you use pre-existing things in inventive and interesting ways. So that's something that I think is really striking about this piece. And I mean, fancy dress was very ephemeral, and it's diversion and it's spectacle and it's fun, but the themes that were selected for the costumes truly reflect the cultural preoccupations of the time. And I think this dress really encapsulates the Victorian taste for the exotic, for things from the empire, and how that intersects with the fascination with the natural world and the ways in which it can be used and exploited and captured. And also how the visual culture of this period associated women with nature in particular, and the idea of metamorphosis. These are recurring themes that you see in the visual culture of the 1900s, like particularly Art Nouveau, where there's those magnificent winged creatures and winged ladies and that sort of thing. So I think it's all connected. And yeah, thank you so much for allowing me to share this wonderful museum object with you. If anyone has any questions, I can endeavour to answer them. Thank you very much.
Jo, thank you very much for sharing that with us. And I know you've got a lot of really incredible items. Oh, what's this?
Oh, this is my bonus slide. I nearly forgot. This is just one example of how the Victorian fascination for beetles pops up here and there in popular culture. And this is a creepy horror novel from 1897, which is called The Beetle. And the villain I'm sorry if this is a terrible spoiler, but the villain in the book is actually an Egyptian scarab beetle that is a murderer and has occult powers. And it's just so Halloween and so fabulous. I had to add it in at the end.
Thank you. It is really fabulous.
Yeah.
It's really great.
There we go.
And also thank you for the reference on that How to Fancy Dress book. That costume was amazing. And I think we all need that book to start planning our Halloween parties. Definitely. We have a couple minutes for questions. We're a little short on time, but if anyone's got any questions for Joe, Lynn, do you?
No, there's just not any questions per se that I can see. Though interesting, Anna said that she was at a party yesterday, children's party, and there were several children dressed up as caterpillars and bees. It's still very popular.
Perennial favourites.
Yeah, and I mean, as an embroiderer, we regularly buy beetle wings.
Interesting.
So our students are still very much stitching with them because they're just so exotic. I mean, it's like using peacock feathers as well. So because of their iridescent quality, they're just great. Oh, there's a raised hand from Veronica, and I was going to actually defer to Veronica given her knowledge on this.
No, I promise I'm not going to talk about Ellen Terry. You are safe. I was actually just going to say, given that we have the museum 5 minutes to sort of share collections, and you've shown just one of the many treasures that I know are in Worthing, it would be quite nice to maybe touch on how people can learn more about the collection and if it's accessible for appointments, that sort of thing.
Oh, sure. Yes, I didn't want to go too much into it because I was aware that I only had a few minutes to talk, but that one costume is one of several 19th century fancy dress costumes that are at Worthing. So if anyone is interested in that area, but the collection as a whole, it's absolutely magnificent. It's over 30,000 pieces, and it's particularly strong on 19th century dress and also handmade and amateur pieces and accessories, and they are open for research appointments. You just need to contact Jerry Connolly, who's the curator manager, and his email is online. If you just Google Worthing Museum, you'll find the contact there. And often I assist with research appointments. Often it's me who goes into the costume store and digs out the boxes. So it would be lovely to meet anybody if they want to come and have a look at the pieces there. Do send him inquiries. It's a really friendly and welcoming museum.
I can attest to that because Joe has actually helped me to look at a piece of 19th century fancy dress and introduced me to those very costume books that she showed there, which include tips on how to dress like Ellen Terry in her Shakespearean roles. So yes, it's a wonderful collection, and Joe is great to work with as well.
Did people imitate that dress? Like, did people imitate the Lady Macbeth dress?
They did at the time and since.
That's wonderful.
But you don't want another paper from me, or you'll get a whole list.
Yes, please.
Less for fancy dress, more for stage dress.
Okay.
I think because it was quite a lot to take on.
Yes, that would be an ambitious costume for a fancy dress party to replicate. I can imagine. I mean, I like to make costumes myself, but that's a commitment, definitely.
One of these days we need to get Zenzi in here for a talk.
Yeah.
Actually, let's put that on the agenda. Zenzi Tinker, for those who don't know, is the person
I could twist her arm.
Huh?
I think I could twist her arm.
Yes, Veronica, put that on your to-do list. To do. Okay, well, thank you so much for this incredible session. It was as delightful or even more delightful than I imagined. So thank you, speakers, for giving us these rich talks. Thank you, everyone, too, for coming along and asking such really good questions. There's been really, really great discussion here. I want to give a special shout out to Yitka for wearing a costume again. I was hoping everyone would show up, but they didn't, and I couldn't bring one anyway. I only took a carry-on. So you have represented very well for us. Thank you so much. Our next at home is going to be a bit earlier in the month, not the last Sunday, but it's going to be the 20th of November this time. and watch this space, because we don't have the lineup quite solidified, and we're all a bit flat out with the new term, so new jobs and new things, but it will be up very, very soon. But mark your calendar, 20th November, probably back to our regular time. And that's all. So have a lovely day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Happy Halloween if you celebrate that. They're getting really ready for the Feast of All Saints here in Italy. It's been a bit mad, actually. So if you celebrate that, enjoy that too. And that's all.